This is Autoline After Hours with John McElroy and Gary Vasilash, episode 578 for November 4th, 2021. Don't roll your eyes. Lyten's battery breakthrough could be for real.
Watch Autoline After Hours live at Autoline.tv every Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 12 p.m. Pacific. You can subscribe to this podcast for free by searching for Autoline in iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube.
Autoline After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.
Hey, Gary.
John, how are you?
It's role reversal here. You're in the studio. I'm holed up in a hotel room in Nashville.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, I was thinking I have not physically been in the studio since February of 2020.
That's
unreal. So what a bizarre thing it was. And so I'm sitting in your seat. So for those of you who are wondering why this background is not what you normally see behind me, that's why, because he's there and I'm here.
Yeah.
But it's going to be a great show today. We've got some very good people that'll be on it. But of course, we've got to start out with a little bit of a quiz.
A little bit of a quick. You're going to make me look like an idiot again.
Not at all, John. Not at all.
That's what he says, folks. But watch this. Go ahead, right, Gary. Shoot.
Okay. So on November 4th, 2007, a very important event took place, which involves a Chevrolet. And I'll give you a little hint that this is somewhat thematic for the show in certain respects.
Okay,
thematic for today.
Okay. So I'm going to guess, November, you said.
November 4th.
And Chevrolet, so I guess that was the intro of the Chevrolet Volt with a V as in Victor.
That's a great guess, but it's wrong. Okay, and okay, now when I tell you what it is, you will understand why I think it is somewhat thematic.
Okay.
The team from Carnegie Mellon won the DARPA Urban Challenge with the Chevy Tahoe, the Boss.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me that one of the participants on today's show was someone that you met there then.
Yes. That's right. Now I know where you're going with all this. Because yes, I was at the DARPA Challenge.
So we're gonna switch up things a little bit. We want to introduce Dave Tuttle, who is with the Energy Institute at University of Texas at Austin. And so you two actually met there, right?
Absolutely. Good to be here. Yeah, I was actually, I think I was watching Autoline back then. And then lo and behold, I was in line for some food. And there was this dude there with an Autoline cap. And I looked and recognized John there. And so I introduced myself.
That's right. And Dave and I have stayed in correspondence ever since then, exchanging opinions of what's going on and in the automotive industry, obviously, and especially with electric cars. And I invited him to be on today's show because he knows so much about this. He's a true believer and he really knows what he's talking about.
So Dave, did you guess correctly?
No, I said the Volt also. Yeah. I had actually serial number 550 of the Volt, and I remember Bob Lutz. I think it was Bob Lutz, and he was commenting how the aerodynamics of the original prototype were such that you could drive it backward and it would have better aero than going forward, right? And so I was going to say the Volt too, but I had forgotten because 2007 we were in Victorville, California.
That's exactly right.
And I remember the GM team there. I met Chris Baroni Bird there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And on that team, just so our audience knows, Chris Urmson, now of Aurora, was part of the Team Tartan, which was the name of the group from Carnegie Mellon that won, as well as Brian Selesky, who's with Argo AI now. And these are two guys that are certainly pushing autonomous technology forward. But enough about that. Let's bring in Christy Schweinsberg from Wards Intelligence. Christy, it's great to have you back on the show. Tell us what you've been up to. What have you been doing? What's going on? What's the future?
Okay. So while I haven't been traveling as much, I know you and I used to see each other on the road all the time, but I've been mostly home working. And I've been doing a lot of preparatory stuff for our 2021 Automotive Tech Week conference. That's happening the week of November 15th in Novi at the Suburban Collection Showplace. So we're going to have 100 speakers, sessions, panel discussions on every topic that you guys discuss here on this show. We've got a Focus Electrification Conference, a Focus Dealer Future Conference. And if folks want to learn more about it, they can go to wardsauto.informa.com/events and learn all about it. And if you can't make it to Detroit, you can, we got digital content as well for the folks that are out of state. So.
All right. So to be fair, did you get my quiz?
I also thought Volt, but I also thought maybe EV, something to do with the EV1.
Yeah.
The movie, I forgot when that came out, Who Killed the Electric Car, but I was also thinking Volt.
That was actually the quiz last week or the week before. Remember that, John?
Yeah.
I didn't see it.
Yeah. So,
okay.
But this was too good to give up. I mean, the Dave and John and all right. So we're talking here all about electric cars. So let me throw this one out there because I think all of you will have some interesting perspectives on this, and it is perhaps somewhat political. So in the House bill that is maybe going to be passed sometime in our lifetime or not, the House Democrats have updated it, and so they're making electric vans, sport utility vehicles, and trucks priced up to $80,000 eligible for a full tax credit. Their previous bill capped the credits at $64,000 for SUVs and vans at $64,000, SUVs at $69,000, and trucks $74,000. They're also putting it so that people who have adjusted gross incomes of $250,000 can get the tax credit. It had previously been $400,000 was the individual for minimum. So is this going to, if this happens, what are the ramifications for electric vehicles on the roads of America?
Dave, why don't you start with that?
Sure. I've been a beneficiary of some of those tax credits and the two EVs that I've bought over the years, but it isn't the main driver. I think that you have to fundamentally have compelling vehicles. And so we're seeing a shift. We've seen a shift, and I think you have to give Tesla credit for this in changing the paradigm from a green vehicle that has a bunch of sacrifices to a better vehicle that happens to be electric. And the more you have these vehicles that are just stellar, and they're superior. I rode in, they had a ride and drive here during the Formula One week, Ford did. So I got to ride in a Lightning EV. And given its low CG and its fully independent suspension, it was an awesome riding truck. It was the best pickup I've ever ridden in, for example. And so I think that's the bigger thing is they have to be something that's, I got to have it, or this is great. And the fundamental powertrain technologies and the advantages can be made to have those gee whiz features or conveniences. So they can do it. The auto manufacturers just can't do compliance cars. And I think that they're getting on board with that. All the ones that are coming out now. There's some challenges with some plug-in hybrids that the Europeans especially have problems with because the all-electric ranges are too short. But that kind of era, we've gotten through the first generation of Volt and Leaf a decade ago, and these short-range plug-in hybrids, and now we're getting so many of them that are really nice cars. So I think that's a bigger thing. And charging infrastructure absolutely matters. Price absolutely matters, but it still has to be something that's compelling.
Christy, you're an electric vehicle enthusiast.
I am. So I totally agree the vehicles need to sell on their own merit. And I think they're worth every penny that the companies are asking of them. However, we're all believers here in electrification, and the majority of Americans are not believers in electrification yet. And any carrot that you can give them to help them become a believer and to reduce the cost of that battery electric vehicle to a level that's commensurate with the cost of an internal combustion engine vehicle, I think is very helpful. And we've seen in the past, Nissan Leaf sales greatly benefited when there were was the federal tax credit. Well, it still has a federal tax credit, but in Atlanta, in Georgia, there were tax credits. There have been regional credits that have put the sales of these vehicles much higher than they would have been otherwise. So I think they're needed, because we need to get those 95% of Americans, or whatever it is, that still are buying internal combustion engine vehicles to switch over to battery electrics.
Yeah, I would agree with both Dave and Christy on that. A lot of people still not sure they're ready yet, but if you have a very generous credit, they're going to want to take advantage of that. I think the real question is, are these credits even going to get through Congress? There's enormous opposition to them on the part of many Republicans. In addition to that, there's this clause that the Democrats have thrown in there that if it's a union UAW made vehicle, it's going to get an extra $4,500. I don't see any chance of that getting through Congress. So that calls into question whether this is going to go through or not. If the Democrats are ready to wheel and deal and do some horse trading, they'll get it through. But if they insist on that union clause, I think it's dead in the water.
So is horse trading still an appropriate term in this whole electric world we're part of? Dave, you live in Texas. I mean, so you might have some observations on this, but let's let that one sit.
Well,
So you mentioned the opportunity to take a ride in a Ford Lightning. So Ford has announced that they have in excess of 160,000 reservations for the Ford Lightning. Do you all think these are real numbers? Do you think that there'll be 160,000 people who will actually take delivery of a Ford Lightning who have made a reservation, or is this people hedging their bets, or just jumping into the pool because someone else is doing that?
Right. A reservation is not a sale, so it's no guarantee of sale. I think they'll do well. Will they sell 160,000 will they convert all of these reservations to sales? I don't think so. Maybe half of them. But it's still exciting. I mean, 80,000 is still a great number.
Christy, you're absolutely right. I had a chance to talk with Lisa Drake from Ford. She's the chief operating officer for North America, and that's exactly what she said. They hope to be able to convert at least half of those into real orders.
So they'll be in a situation where they'll have more demand than they'll have production capability, probably for the first 2 years anyway. Secondly, what we've seen, there's a push in our city for fleet electrification for the city of Austin. And that's the first vehicle that is OEM produced that you could see has the range and capability. And so you may be surprised that there may be enough fleet sales beyond that.
So basically, you're talking about the city of Austin is doing this. This is
electrifying buses and whatever vehicle. So there's a lot of bolts, and there were leafs, for example, for the meter readers and inspectors, city inspectors. And so they've got the fleet data that says how much TCO savings they achieve. And so I think that when the right models come out, that they'll be ready and purchased. So there may be a surprise of it. And Ford has targeted that apparently because they've talked about the product line that has sort of a fleet focus.
So do you think that the Lightning will be purchased more by municipalities than by individuals?
No, because when it rides better than a Platinum, so I think there are a lot of, my son-in-law just bought an F-250 Power Stroke, and it's probably one of the most expensive vehicles that our whole family has ever purchased, right? When you start like, and so when you get to a Lariat or Platinum, or take any of the Ram or Tundra or any of the pickups that are outfitted so nicely, they're expensive vehicles, and they're luxurious vehicles. And that vehicle has the ride. I would imagine all the EV pickups are going to have independent suspension and low center of gravity just inherently. So they'll all have that advantage. And then there's features that may be really popular in Texas, considering what we went through in February, with vehicle power export. If you're in California, and you have PSPS, that's public safety power shutoffs. We had a little incident, to say the least, in February, where if you can take the vehicle and power your home with it, or you have hurricanes in the coast, that type of technology, that will spread. When your neighbor gets it, and all of a sudden they're the only ones with the lights on.
So Dave, how long was the power outage for you last February?
It all depended on where you are. There's complexities with what they can turn off. And they had to shut down so much of the grid so rapidly to save it that there's certain layers of load that you can shed. And so some people weren't out at all during the whole period. Other people were out for days. And so it all depended on what you were. If you happen to be on the same circuit as a hospital or a sewer system pumping station, for example, then you stayed on with it. If you happen to be part of the other half of loads that weren't associated with the feeder that powered those critical loads, then you were shut off more.
It's probably the only time somebody wanted to live near a sewer pumping station. I'm just suggesting. Christy, what do you think? Do you think that the Lightning will be a big hit? You know, and to be fair, I mean, we had to take into account the fact that this past weekend, Rivian delivered its first R1T pickup truck. And, you know, so Rivian's in the game, and we will shortly be getting the Hummer EV pickup will be out there. So Dave, you know, you got to keep this competition in mind. Christy, where do you think it's going?
I think initially, yeah, Ford might sell more of the Lightnings to municipalities. They'll probably get their orders in earlier than the general public, or they'll have a bigger order bank for those municipalities than for the general public. But I think it'll balance out within a year or two, and you'll, you know, have more individual sales versus fleet sales. But yeah, there's a lot of great competition out there, great competition coming. I don't know if the GMC Hummer is going to be a fleet vehicle, maybe for some small businesses, you know,
or Beverly Hills.
Yeah, potentially. But I think the traditional looking pickups are gonna be a bigger fleet, appeal to fleets more so than a GMC Hummer. But we'll see.
Well, I can tell you Ford thinks they're going to do quite well with it, because they've already announced an expansion of the assembly plant where they're making the Lightning, and they've been stunned by the reaction to the truck. Now we'll have to see, can they really turn those into orders and not just be a 1 year flash in the pan? But Ford's pretty bullish on the reception that truck's received.
Mm-hmm. And Silverado E is going to be announced at CES. I guess you'll be there to see that.
That's right.
So there'll be plenty of competition in the truck space, which is somewhat interesting, given that, you know, we are seeing the conventional truck going up against something like a Rivian, which, you know, here's a company that basically had built nothing. And you know, John and I have had the opportunity to drive that truck, and, you know, I am just completely stunned by the build quality of that vehicle in many ways, and I think John is as well.
Yeah, it's a good truck. They should do well. Where do you get them? That's the question. And you know, Ford's got a dealership in every single community across the country. That's what the startups are going to be fighting against, is distribution and maintenance and repairs as well. But there's no question, Rivian's got a competitive truck.
Tesla's done okay.
Yes, I was just going to say that Tesla did just quite fine without all that, John. And
well, yeah, but it's taken Tesla a decade to get to where they are, and facing no real competition, as Dave said. You know, they were up against compliance cars. So this is, when it comes to the electric pickups, it could be a different scenario, much more competitive in terms of the traditionals fighting off the startups.
And there's another thing too. Rivian will still have its 200,000 vehicles that it could make and get the $7,500 tax credit, right? So that could be an advantage for a while. And I think there was a lot of ground plowed by Tesla that people can imitate much more quickly than pioneering it, where you have, you get your service on your app and your phone, you schedule it, mobile rangers that may come for minor services to your house. So you build out the service infrastructure with a bunch of vehicles that go out to different neighborhoods. There's a lot of innovation that's now kind of contemplated, and people have discovered that it works. And that makes it easier for others to draft behind it.
Yeah, good
Very
point.
true.
So, I mentioned that Rivian delivered its first vehicle over the weekend. Lucid delivered its first Air over the weekend. We had Peter Rawlinson and Derek Jenkins on the show 3 or 4 months ago. So, John, according to what I've read, that Lucid plans to deliver 575 Airs by the end of the year. Does that number seem right to you?
It's a very small number, to be sure. Keep in mind, we're in the middle of a chip shortage. Keep in mind, they're launching their plant. I think they probably want to make sure that these things go out the door absolutely perfect. Tesla, to use Dave's terminology, is plowing a lot of things. And they had some pretty sketchy quality early on. They also had a very forgiving customer base.
Yeah.
But I think, now any startup has got to launch at a very high level of quality. And especially, what's the price of that Lucid Air? It's like $160,000 or something like that, right? So higher, 170,000?
Yeah, 169 and change.
Okay, 170, call it. And they're positioning this car as the luxurious electric car versus Tesla, which they would argue really does not have a luxurious interior. So, yeah, I think the number that you quoted of what they're going to deliver by the end of the year is a very small number. But the fact that they're delivering cars bodes well for any kind of a startup, and that's going to keep the cash flow going.
So let's shift from just electric cars to talk about what's going on in the industry, because while not all OEMs report their numbers, we did just have sales for October. And it seems that in the aggregate, they're down 23% year over year. Christy, what's your sense of what's going on in the market right now?
I think the chip shortage is having a huge impact. People want certain vehicles down to specific colors and, heated seats, heated steering wheel. It's just really hard to find that sort of perfect recipe of vehicle. So I think people are sitting out. There's price gouging going on among some dealers. Just some ridiculous prices being placed on the hoods of these vehicles. So I think, it's understandable that sales are down so sharply.
Yeah. So apparently, Toyota has sold more than 2 million vehicles this year, which puts them ahead of General Motors. Is there something there, John? Or is that just lucky to them?
No, it's not lucky whatsoever. It just shows that Toyota has the best view deep down into its supply chain of any automaker, any major automaker, certainly. And they've been able to keep production going better than just about everybody else, probably with the exception of Tesla. Even Toyota's been impacted by it. But just going back to sales last month in the U.S. market, automakers still managed to sell over 1 million vehicles, despite the chip shortage. I think there's something, positive in that news. We also saw the SAR go up a little bit last month. So the demand is there. If these car companies could only get the chips, man, they'd have a whale of a year. And things should look a whole lot better next year. And 2023 could be the best yet, the way these things are going.
All right. So I want to read a quote here from Jeff Schuster, who's the president of LMC Automotive, and this was in response to what has just been reported. And Dave, maybe you can give us some insight on what you think this means. So according to Jeff Schuster, this is sort of a long quote, but bear with me. We now believe that we are at or just past the peak in the semiconductor crisis, but there is an array of risks and other disruptions in the background that remain a significant threat. The latest is a possible shortage of magnesium, which has the potential to derail a recovery in the production in 2022 and possibly even further into 2023. John. While the volumes may start to improve from the lows of 2021, we continue to expect production to be well below pre-pandemic levels for some time, and demand could also suffer from rising transaction prices, pushing some consumers out of the market. So Dave, magnesium.
Well, we've had conversations within UT about critical materials. The supply chain, there's just story after story about supply chain issues, whether it be truckers sitting around waiting for the docks to get unloaded, a supply shortage there of truckers, and just the whole supply chain seems to be bottlenecked up. So I don't think it's just chips. I think it's just rippling. And there's this other dynamic, folks in the older demographic, some of them, if they've saved enough money, are seeing this situation where maybe it's time for me to retire. And so the labor shortage isn't just young people. I think there's going to be huge opportunities, I think, for younger people, because there's going to be this vacuum of the baby boomers finally getting out of the workforce. Okay. So it's just an unusual situation, story after story about all facets of the supply chain. It's not just chips. It's how you deliver it, how you deal with it. And then, somebody else can probably talk about the tariffs.
So John and Christy, do you think it's more than just chips?
Well, it's definitely more than just chips. I mean, we know there's been plastic shortages going back to the winter storm in Texas that shut down, the plastics making facilities there. Everything's backed up right now. That's why I said I was so surprised to see that automakers sold 1 million cars and trucks last month, despite all these things. And then, there's the next hiccup down the line is, where are we going to get all the raw materials to make batteries for electric vehicles? I mean, I'm being told there just isn't enough nickel to build enough batteries just to meet the demand for what automakers say they're going to sell in the United States.
Yeah, the supply chain is just an absolute disarray right now. And you're right, John. I mean, that's another looming issue, is we've got all these prognostications about future volume for battery electric vehicles, but the materials are in short supply.
So John, what are the numbers nowadays about how much money is being put on the hood, right? It isn't any money put on the hood. As a matter of fact, the customer's having to put money on the hood.
They're just stacking Bitcoin.
Right. David, supply and demand, right? And so demand is through the roof and the supply is not there. Prices are going up. But Christy, you alluded to it earlier, and this is where the big backlash is happening. Dealers marking up cars. I mean, we've seen Corvettes with $30,000 markups. I mean, dealers are delusional if they think the public is going to stand for this and run to their protection when all these startups want to do direct sales models. I mean, I just can't believe that the dealers can't control themselves. It's just outrageous, the kinds of prices that they're charging. And, in the Detroit area, there's so many people who've got a brother-in-law or a cousin or somebody who can get them a deal on a car because they work at one of the car companies or suppliers. Now dealers are refusing to meet those discounts. And so there's a lot of backlash against dealers with this.
So switching up a little bit, and Dave, I want to ask you about this, since you have some particular expertise in autonomous vehicle space. So we're seeing that there is an 18.4% increase in the traffic fatalities for the first half of this year compared to last year. So this presumably goes to the fact of more people driving than they were last year. Do you see this as being a greater reason for autonomy to get here faster?
I think that ADAS systems will help. I mean, once in a while you get nudged. I have one car that has the seat that vibrates. And so if you're drifting left, your left bun gets vibrated. If you're drifting to the right, you're right. And it's a helpful thing. And it also starts getting you better at signaling. being more disciplined, because if it knows you're going to drift left because you've got your turn signal on, it doesn't give you the shock.
Mhm.
You know? And
But
so,
all that technology has been there. I mean, so people who are driving, in March, had all that ADAS stuff, yet there are still more deaths. And
it's
we're
people
talking.
are driving. People are getting back. It was so interesting during the depth of the COVID situation, how we went from a city that was growing leaps and bounds, and people used to complain about traffic, and it was amazing. It reminded me of when I first moved to Austin, how many decades ago, right? Just getting out of graduate school. And now it's coming back, but it just seems like, even though some people certainly can complain about it, it's still better than it was because there's more flexibility to work. But the point is, people are driving more.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so with that, we'll take a quick break and we'll come back with our special guest. So we even have more. I mean, I'm sure people are just wondering how we could possibly have more, but we do. So we're going to hear from our friends at Bridgestone.
Look at that.
We are back.
But Dan Cook from Lyten, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Oh, glad to be here, John, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, we need to learn a whole lot more about what you guys are doing. And so I'm going to throw it in Dave Tuttle's lap to start this off, because I think he's got more expertise in this than the rest of us. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, thanks. Dan, impressive technology. I saw your interview with John. And
let's back up a little bit here, Dave, and set the stage. I should have. Lyten has come up with a new way of making batteries using graphene, so it can make only lithium sulfur, which means you don't need manganese or copper or cobalt or anything like that in there. There's a microscope looking at what it looks like. But sorry to cut you off, but just for those who are tuning in and don't know what the heck Lyten or Dan Cook is all about, back to you, Dave.
All right, wait. So no. Okay, so John, you threw out that they did graphene. Okay, so these guys did 3D graphene. I think we need to know what graphene is before we get to the question of what silicon or lithium sulfur is, and Dave's question. I mean, let's really set the stage to say, what did you guys do there?
Okay. Back to Dan.
Okay, so I'm going to use my Zoom-inspired demo, Gary, to answer your question. But I'll start with using my hand as a flat plane. Graphene is a series of interconnected 6-ring atom arrays, if you will. They look like, if you look at a soccer ball, you'll see a 6-ring element on a soccer ball. Imagine a whole bunch of those connected in a flat plane. What we've done at Lyten is to create crinkles, literally, in that graphene, and where it's crude, but where my knuckles are represent, or my joints articulate, represent crinkles in an otherwise flat 2D graphene setup. And so the three-dimensionality introduces new reactive surfaces, edges, if you will, that can interact with elements off the periodic table around it, polymers and other things that make it very reactive. In fact, we think as much as 1,000 times more reactive than planar graphene, because the only thing that reacts around on the planar graphene is the edge. And if you think about a sheet of paper as an example, the edge is a very, very small part of it.
So the net of this is, you want to tell as far as how many, say, watt hours per kilogram your technology has as an advantage over what's being shipped today in EVs?
Yeah, so as John mentioned, Dave, when you can actually incorporate sulfur, if you can use it in energy storage, has the ability to house a whole lot more lithium atoms around it, as I'm sure you're well aware, up to 5 times more. And so our construct, our architecture will take us to a targeted 3x over conventional lithium-ion energy, specific energy density, if you will. Less, not the same kind of a multiple in the volumetric end, but certainly in the gravimetric end, up to 3x. And so this is really where we're headed. and everything has to do with how this graphene works with the sulfur.
And so instead of today's, about 250 watt hours per kilogram, you're 3 times that potentially?
That's right. That's
wow.
right.
And so what kind of levers can you pull on that? Because if you want to get more cycle life or faster DC fast charging, can you trade off a little bit of density for those characteristics?
Yeah, and this is what what can be done with this. The material is actually tunable. So when I made this very crude example, Dave, if you watch the camera, you can see that I can actually adjust the number of crinkles and so on in the construct. I can also adjust the shape. I can make them. For example, I can make multi-shell fullerenes. If you're familiar with those, they're like soccer balls inside of soccer balls. And buckyballs, yes, inside of buckyballs. And so we can create different, what were known as morphologies and shapes of this material. So the trade-offs become what we call hierarchical structural trade-offs. So we can actually form the material to be a mechanical container of sulfur, or what we call a caging element to sulfur. So that's physical. But we can also tune the material in its properties to also be conductive, which allows the charges to transmit very quickly through the structure. And depending on how you adjust conductivity, you can adjust things like power density. So it's all interlinked, if you will. But the heart of it really is in the form and shape and function of the 3D graphene. The other thing that's really interesting that I'll add to that is that we can shape it in such a way as to allow the sulfur to be very interdispersed with the graphene. And I shared with John when I was at Motorbella how we have a broad range of thermal performance, -30 to +60. And a lot of that has to do with the clever way that we integrate the graphene with the sulfur. So it's not just a big clump sort of in the middle, so to speak, of the cathode.
So okay, since I didn't do very well in chemistry, I think you need to take me like way back in this. Okay.
Sure.
So are you using the sulfur to contain the lithium ions, and that's why there's an advantage to what you're doing? So then when it goes from the anode to the cathode or vice versa, that it's more efficient?
Well, what we do is, if you can imagine a cage as an analog. So if you could create a cage with bars on the cage, Gary, wherein the sulfur, which has more attached sites, if you will, than a conventional NMC cathode, the lithium ions actually go through the bars. So the bars are narrow enough to keep the sulfur in, but wide enough to allow the lithium to come in and out. And so you essentially create, by being able to use sulfur, you create this paradigm of increased capacity just by virtue of its chemical makeup. So it's not necessarily associated with the transport. It's really associated with the atomic properties of sulfur with respect to the lithium. It's just a higher capacity type of material to use in the battery.
Dan, what type of cost per cell are you envisioning, and do you see an advantage against traditional lithium-ion chemistries?
Well, for sure, the cost is going to be below ICE or internal combustion engine parity. In fact, it's going to be well below there at scale. And the reason is because, as you all know, you just mentioned, there's a lot of upward pressure on nickel, manganese, cobalt stuff to get. Our raw materials are, for the large part of our battery, are natural gas, which is cheap and plentiful, electricity, which is relatively low cost, and sulfur, aside from the other, from the anode, which is lithium metal. And so the cost structure, by definition, is fractional compared to NMC. So we see very attractive costs well below the magic ICE parity line. In fact, likely below solid state.
Okay, so
solid state, that's really saying something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, you just go back, and the solid state batteries have NMC. Most of them have NMC cathodes. So you got to get past the cathode to knock the cost down.
So below $100 a kilowatt hour.
Very easily, yes.
Okay.
So
So
how
Dan,
about
tell us this too. I mean, graphene is still a relatively new material. It was invented or discovered, I guess maybe is the better word, about 20 years ago, if that.
Right.
And my understanding is there's not a lot of manufacturing production of it. Can you get enough graphene to make batteries in scale?
Well, it's a great question, John, and that's really where we're focused is on performance and scaling of the operation. And the good news is that we have sort of an analog process that precedes us, which is we're in Silicon Valley. We're not using the same technology, but it's an analog technology to the deposition of silicon, and that technology, as ours, is continuous. So our material runs continuously in our reactors, and that lends itself to a scale opportunity, which we're currently working very diligently on now to keep up with what we think are going to be very large battery numbers.
Can you talk about how you get from coin cell prototypes and some number of hundreds, let's say, to a 30 gigawatt hour gigafactory or multiple of them? Are you going to be there's a big leap there. Are you going to be licensing the technology or building your own gigafactories? And can you kind of walk the layman people through how you get from your prototypes to large scale manufacturing that's really challenging?
Well, the first part of that, Dave, the first part of that question is pretty easy because we've done coin cells, we've done up to 20-layer pouch cells, and actually our product is made on production equipment. One of the good things about Lyten's lithium sulfur architecture is that we've designed it in such a way that we can produce it on conventional equipment, which is really important for OEMs that are sinking billions of dollars into conventional technology. We would like to think that at some point down the road, when we get to market, those investments will be preserved because we can make lithium sulfur on the same machines. But to finish off the other second half of your question is, okay, so now you can make your architecture on production equivalent equipment. How do you get to a gigafactory? And the fortunate part that I have is a great team of guys who have automotive experience, like myself. I spent years at GM in the components, one of the large component divisions, as well as one of the assembly divisions, and I know that model change ramp that used to hit in the August timeframe, and you had to perform to the tune of millions and millions of whatever it was you were making. So you can't take it lightly. It's a lot of work to set up a giga facility, but our plans are to do just that. In fact, we think we will be the only domestically supply chained and localized assembly house, battery house in the U.S. by the time we get there. So we're really excited about that. And the one other question you might ask, or maybe Christy might have on the tip of her tongue, is, well, what about the supply chain? And that's a big issue too, because the reality of it is that there's a lot of the supply chain that's developed offshore for the components to go into batteries. Fortunately, we have a ton of natural gas, and there's a ton of electricity and sulfur running around the U.S. In fact, there's also a lot of lithium carbonate equivalent as well. So we have a lot of material that's situated on shore, unlike the other architectures. So we don't have to contend with that. But the rest of the battery has suppliers in it as well that has to be contended with, and some of those are offshore. But we've been busy working with our supply chain, and the ones that are offshore are extremely excited about coming onshore ultimately and tooling up for domestic capacity. So you can never take scaling for granted. It's a lot of hard work, but I think we're up for it with the team that we have, and I think the market's there is for it. And there's also one other little thing that I know John would probably bring up called USMCA compliance, and boy, that's going to be a big deal, I think, when it hits.
So let me ask you that. Okay, if we look at the auto industry for the last 100 and some years, things have been fairly consistent. And if we look at, say, gasoline, right? I mean, every vehicle uses basically the same kind of gasoline. Little difference for racing or whatnot, but pretty much the same. Now, when we're talking about battery chemistry, I mean, there are a plethora of different types of batteries. I mean, I was reading about a lithium metal battery, which some are claiming is the holy grail. Now, you guys have a different approach. I mean, how do you think an automaker is going to be able to sort out which is the right way for them to go? I mean, they're going to be making some big bets here.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm not in their shoes right now, but if you want my opinion, I'll give it as an engineer myself and a guy who has worked in the supply function within an OEM. And you really have to lean on your supply base to really help you out. And guys like me and guys like who are on our team see the economic value of innovation and want to meet that need. I think that one of the things that's going to be important for them clearly is lower left, upper right performance over time. And what I mean by that is give me a steady improvement equation, upper left or upper right, lower left cost equation over time, because these things need to come down in cost. And have an evolution to your technology that fits that. And oh, by the way, when I tool it, make sure that I don't have to throw my tools away after 2 or 3 years, so I can get the payback. And so, as an ex-auto guy, these are things at least that I would think would be very important to them. Is durability of investment, continuous performance, and a cost curve that goes along with it. And so you pick the technology that meets that need.
Dan, I was wondering about recycling. I did a research report on recycling last year, and speaking to a lot of companies that are engaged in lithium-ion recycling, they really like those expensive materials. They like the cobalt, they like the nickel, because it makes their business profitable. You're
Right.
saying you're not going to have those expensive materials in your cells. So what is the recycling likelihood going to be?
Well, our anode contains lithium metal, and we do some special things to the anode to make sure that it is high performing as well as durable and reliable. So the opportunity is to essentially get to the lithium in the recycle, Christy, and melt it down and reuse it. And so our recycling scheme, there's a couple different ways of doing recycling lithium sulfur, but one of them is to basically just simply disassemble the cell and extract the lithium metal out. There's some steps in there, of course, but basically melt it down and reuse it. So we will disappoint recyclers who are looking for the nickel and the manganese and the cobalt in there. I'll have to say that, but when you look at the environment, which we are very sensitive, remember we're based in California, which has got some pretty aggressive environmental standards, where we've done well to wheels on our battery against conventional lithium ion as well as solid state, and against the conventional approach, we're a 60% reduction in greenhouse gas footprint. So I guess the point is we'll take it in the reduction of the footprint as opposed to in the recycle.
Hey, Dan, talk a little bit about cycles. My understanding is no one's gone with lithium sulfur right now because they worked great over a short period of time, and then it wasn't any good. And cold weather performance.
Yep.
For those of us who live in the snow belt, cold weather performance of EVs is a concern.
Sure, John. Well, cycling, you're right. You're absolutely right. I go back, Gary, to your question about the caging describing the caging of the sulfur. You've got to be able to hang on to that sulfur within that sort of that cage construct. If you don't, it runs all around the electrolyte and the battery fouls. And that's really been the history, one of the history, stories behind lithium sulfur. So we think we've got a handle on that. But nevertheless, the challenge of life cycle is and having capacity and charge rate and at the same time is the lithium sulfur opportunity. And as I know, John, I think we had shared at Motor Bella for certain military applications, we've achieved over 1,400 cycles in our lithium sulfur architecture. One OEM that sampled cells way early in 2021 saw over 200 cycles under beyond 200 cycles on a conventional auto protocol, and we've come a distance from there. And so the cycle life is something that we pay a lot of attention to as we do rate and as we do capacity, and that's what we're currently working on right now with our qualification program, John. I think that we mentioned back in September.
Yeah. And how about cold weather performance?
Sure. So on cold weather, it's actually, this is the clever method I mentioned earlier. We don't just, if you can imagine, Gary, I go back to you on the caging. If you clump all of that sulfur in the cage, how does all the lithium get to the sulfur in the middle of the clump? Well, what if you find a way, you could come up with a way of actually interdispersing that sulfur with the graphene in a clever way that actually allows the electrons to fly, or if you will, the charges and ions to go in and out of that composite set of materials. And so what that does, John, is that interdispersion and the participation with at a large on a large percentage basis, and it's called sulfur utilization. When it's above 80%, we think that's an interdispersion ratio, if you will, that allows, or quotient that allows you to have that intimacy between the graphene and sulfur, and that translates into thermal performance. And so that's the -30 to +60. And as a former Michigan resident living up near the Flint area, I can assure you that you're absolutely right. It gets cold, and that's a really important factor. And we've been paying attention to it along the way. The other architectures I know I think have to heat below a certain level, but this is something that's important to us, and at least we've gotten it to -30.
Let me jump in here with a question from one of our viewers. John U. Public writes, lithium is explosive and sulfur burns hot, and both are difficult to extinguish. How safe is the Lyten battery in an auto wreck?
Well, I'll be honest, we haven't put them in cars yet, and that's where we're going. But here's what I can share to that viewer for consumption. We've actually done 3 safety tests through third parties. The first one that we've tested is the penetration, which you basically charge the battery up and you drive a nail or drive a skewer through it. And when we did that, our battery actually, the temperature did rise to 38 degrees Celsius, which is basically enough to hang on to in your hand. You can hold it while the nail's going through it at full charge. We didn't see any flaming. The second type of test we did was we actually overcharged it. In fact, we doubled the voltage on it and ran it for a number of hours, and the battery went up 10 degrees C from room temperature. So even when you overcharge it, we haven't experienced thermal runaway. And then lastly, of course, is take it and crush it. Pretend you're in a car accident and see what happens. And we got a modest temperature increase there, but the batteries kept working. So we don't have metal oxides, which is what comes with the traditional NMC or the nickel, manganese, cobalt architecture. And oxides are, tinder for flames and, upwards of, several thousand degrees. So this is something we're going to pay close attention to. Obviously, safety is extremely critical in automotive design. But we think we're on the right track so far.
Dave.
Sure. So what kind of design tools? I used to design microprocessors and computers, and then as the technology progressed, we had to get more sophisticated in the digital environment to simulate and understand the parasitics and such not. So what's the analogy in battery development? What kind of tools do you use beyond, or do you think are critical so you can actually see the molecular interactions, beyond cryogenic electron microscopes or X-ray diffraction and things like that? How do you see into it and then see dendrites growing or other things that you have to go then figure out how to stop or fix or embellish?
Sure. Well, on the design side, we have software tools that we can use to model the performance based on let's call it, as you may, I think, mentioned earlier, sort of tuning the knobs or varying the variables. So we can do that in software. But beyond that, remember, we're actually producing the graphene from scratch. In other words, we start with methane or natural gas, electricity, and we come out the other side with separated hydrogen, if you will, and deposited carbon on the bottom. So we have a very sophisticated. We spent a lot of money outfitting a factory. Actually, we have the first 3D graphene fab in Silicon Valley that also is soon to have a battery pilot facility in it. But we've spent an enormous amount of time and effort and resources to characterize and track the production of this graphene, because it's a super critical element. And then beyond that, of course, we have various techniques, analytic techniques, to look at the cells while they're under cycle, to look at things like polysulfide migration and so on, which is important. And then in the end, we tear them down, and we see what broke and what failed, and take it from there. But a lot of it is the building of quality material in results in the proper result out, and that's really what we found. It's a lot about what you put into it, and that includes the lithium and the type of lithium metal you put in too.
Dan, should everything go well, how quickly do you think you can get these cells in market, and what do you see as the most likely first application for them?
Sure. Well, timing-wise, we shared this earlier this year at Motorbella. We're, if you will, our startup is targeted for 25, but we're planning on ramping in 26. As a guy that used to do factories, and I think Dave, as you mentioned, it's no small feat to start up a factory. So that's our plan at this point. So that's when we think we'll be in market. And I apologize, you had a second part of that question. I want to make sure I got to it.
Oh, most likely first application. I've read maybe consumer electronics could be.
Sure. Well, what we think, it's actually our first formal application has been in the defense area. And as we shared the story with John at Motorbella, like, where did you guys come from? And all of a sudden, you guys are talking about a lithium sulfur battery, and some people have been spending 20 years working on that, and you guys just showed up. Well, the reality of it is that we've been working for years with the federal government on batteries for the military, and they've been very supportive of us. And so that's really our first application, and why we've been at it for years quietly. The first commercial application is, of course, automotive, because, as I think in your prior segment, you were talking about this, there's been enormous pledges of conversion to EVs. And so there is such an enormous need for the supply chain to catch up, I think, to that. And we see that. And automotive, of course, is a very critical industry for our country. And having been in it myself, so I think it's a very important space for us to continue to advance in. But the second commercial market that we think is all of a sudden creeping up on us is the air mobility market. And it turns out that lithium sulfur is an absolute natural for that because of the high energy density, whereas some of the other architectures just aren't there in terms of their gravimetric energy density, and it's all about weight in airplanes, and safety as well. So we think that's the second commercial market outside automotive.
So Dan, has any automaker started testing your battery yet? I know they want to keep all this stuff secret. What can you tell us of the interest on the part of automakers? Sure.
Well, the short answer is yes. An OEM has tested these already. I just mentioned earlier in 2021 there was interaction there, and it continues. The truth of the matter is that we've talked to 5 OEMs, and we are well along in our progression of our commercial discussions with them, to a point where they've led us to the JDA, the investment, and even in some instances, long-term supply agreements. So there's
What's JDA?
Oh, that stands for Joint Development Agreement. Sorry for the buzzword or the buzz acronym. But what we've done is we're currently, as I mentioned to you at Motorbella, we will begin qualification in the fourth quarter, and we're on track with the builds for our qualification. And we are now building towards specific customer objectives, which I'm afraid I can't share on the air. But we're proceeding along those lines, which are well within the ranges of performance that in different parameters that we've demonstrated before. But what we're going to do, our plan is to not announce the results nor the relationships until they're complete. And so I do want to go on record, John, by saying you will be the first one to know when that happens. So
it's a deal.
Commitment. All right.
Thanks.
All right. So let me switch this up a little bit and ask you a two-part question.
Okay.
So according to your official biography, you worked closely with Steve Jobs. So the first part of the question is, what did you learn from Steve Jobs that is applicable to any of this? And the second question is, what about an Apple car?
Oh boy. Well, I have to say, Steve Jobs is a phenomenal technologist, and I did have the opportunity to work with him, like many others over the years. I worked with him at Next Computer, which was between Apples, but Steve Jobs is one of the country's best innovators, as far as I'm concerned, and I wonder what he would think if he knew that his guys were actually dreaming up a car. It's a pretty interesting idea, because there's a ton. I'm half automotive, half high tech, and there's a lot of tech in an electric car. So Silicon Valley will continue to be very relevant, in the automotive space as Tesla is. But anyway, I think he'd be very interested in a car, and frankly, I'd like to see what Apple might do with the vehicle. But as far as takeaways from Steve Jobs and what I learned, I had the opportunity to put a factory together for him, along with some other folks, but did a lot of work on it. And Steve had enormous attention to detail, and he impressed that upon me and many others in the company at the time. So having attention to detail in your product is very important. And that's just not how it looks, it's how it performs. Steve would fixate over a screw inside a box, an electronics box, and its finish and its position. So attention to detail would be one. I think another thing that Steve, legacy that he's left behind for many others to look at is he used to drive innovation in places that it didn't exist. And, there was courage that I think he had somewhere in all that, to know that his innovations that he came up with could be visualized and realized. And I had the opportunity to spend a number of years with him watching just those things happen. So there's a courage of innovation, I think, that he put out, and I know, again, many other people who worked in those environments would probably agree with me. The rest of it that you've read about in his biography, if you had a chance to pick up the book and read it, I found a lot of truth in that. So many examples. It's a great place to go to learn about Steve Jobs. It came out shortly after he passed away. So.
Good stuff.
Yep.
Dave, any other last burning question here?
Well, sure. Maybe just some education for those of us who aren't directly involved. So it looks like your technology can do cylindrical, prismatic, or pouch. Mm-hmm. Are there any general rules of thumb that you see about what application spaces favor, each one of those form factors?
Well, it's automotive, I think, can hit all three of those. I think, we're not necessarily into the electronic space. I think, Christy, you asked me that earlier, and that has to do with the fact that lithium sulfur is not high up on the list on volumetric energy density, although our roadmap will take it to some very respectable levels. But when you look at some of these applications like defense, they typically go with prismatic or cylindricals, not necessarily pouches, is our understanding and what we've experienced thus far, although things may change there. But I think that the limiting, most of what I think we're going to see, Dave, is in the pouch and cylindrical, in the automotive space, and I think we'll probably see the same thing in air. Although we're just getting to really understand what the air guys are looking for in their products.
So Dan, we know you have a hard stop that we've passed. So
okay.
we're gonna thank you for indulging us, and
sure.
Really want to thank you for being on the show today. So.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure, and Gary, Dave, Christy, and especially John, always a pleasure to talk. And glad to meet new faces here, and I look forward, John, I'll follow up on that commitment on the day. So I look forward to that when we have a chance to share again.
Yeah, Dan, what you guys are doing is very exciting. I wish you the best of luck. I can't wait to see how it all develops.
All right. Well, thank you, and I appreciate the support as always. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye-bye.
So Dave, Christy, thank you.
Dave,
John,
Christy, great having you guys all there. And Gary, you fit in my seat very well there.
Oh, it's your seat though. So, all right. So next week we're going to have Mike Swears, the chief engineer of the Tundra, on the show. So come back then. So thanks, everyone.
Autoline After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.
Visit our website, Autoline.tv, where you can watch us live Thursday afternoons. Get your daily fix with Autoline Daily and in-depth analysis and interviews with Autoline This Week. There's all that and much more at Autoline.tv.